Charmaine, can I,
What were you saying, Holly?
wanted to pause for the recording to begin. Go ahead. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So before we begin the program, we do want to acknowledge the election that many of us participated in 2 days ago. Elections are very emotional and we vote our values. And so just want to let you know that, as Forefront, we are here. We're here for you. We will have several webinars that we will be sharing with you to help support the work that, that you're already engaged in. So with that, we'd like to start our program, Public-Private Partnership Series, aligning cross-sector efforts to advance racial equity with Dr. Coleman at the governor's office here in Illinois. Our agenda today will speak a little bit about Forefront. If you're not familiar with Forefront, we'll share with you some general information and then also go a little bit deeper into the public policy work that Holly is leading, as well as the Racial Equity Collective that I lead here at Forefront. Then we will share the space with Dr. Coleman, who will explain a lot of the efforts that's already underway in terms of engaging with the nonprofit sector. And then we'll have opportunity for discussion and Q&A. If you have questions that come up in between as we're presenting, please do feel free to share it in chat or raise your hand, and we'll address them as the presentation goes on. So Forefront has turned 50 years old as of this year, and we are here to support both the nonprofit and the grant makers in the social impact sector. We have, as you see, some of the work that we do is to educate, convene, and mobilize the sector. Recently, we've gone through a strategic planning and a strategic shift where we center all of our work in to make sure, we advance racial equity across Illinois. And then our members and stakeholders include both individuals as well as operating nonprofits and grant makers, as we mentioned earlier. I won't go too much in detail because we have a membership orientation coming up if you're interested, but some of our member benefits are listed here, with the job board, fiscal sponsorship. We have some training opportunities as well as library services. We do also support a lot of work that are outside of our membership. We are a mission-driven organization. And so some of the services that we provide to everyone are included here. You could sign up for our biweekly newsletter where we share a lot of information, not just at Forefront, the programming at Forefront, but also that, our partner organizations put together. I will go a little bit more detail at the Racial Equity Collective that was launched about 2 years ago, along with our new strategic plan. We will then we'll talk about the public policy in detail in a minute as well, but then we also have a few other services that you can all participate in. James, I think at full screen. There we go. Thank you. And then I'll share this with or introduce Holly Ambulo, who is my peer and my partner in this work to make sure that we work closely to really create those systemic changes to build more inclusive community across Illinois. So I'll give this to Holly so you can learn a little bit more about the public policy program that we have.
Thank you, Charmaine. Thanks to everybody for being here today. So Forefront has had a somewhat varied, but in terms of substance, but consistent work in the field of public policy for our 50-year history. And those priorities and scope have changed over time, but fundamental to our work in the policy arena is strong partnerships with many of the organizations that you see here. And it includes work at the federal, state, and at times local level when needed, in the city of Chicago in particular. And we partner closely at the federal level with organizations such as the United Philanthropy Forum, the Council on Foundations, Independent Sector, and National Council of Nonprofits. And through those partnerships, we have counterparts in other states that also serve as the nonprofit associations in other states. And so we all kind of row in the same direction at the federal level. And some of those organizations are the ones that are hosting the post-election debrief events that we shared at the top of the meeting. So those are great opportunities to understand the impact of the elections at the federal level, and where we're headed from here. And we have a core commitment in our policy program to policies that advance racial equity. We look for how to include related talking points and data in all of our collateral in the policy program. And Charmaine and I are peers at Forefront, and we partner closely, and we're working together to make sure that the racial equity focus is embedded in all of our work, not just in the policy arena, but also in everything Forefront does. So she and I work closely together and are thinking about the policy response to her work and the Racial Equity Collective with James. So I'm a registered lobbyist. I help represent the sector when needed through lobbying, direct lobbying, and also through other forms of advocacy. And we work closely with the policy committee to help steer our program. And we invite your feedback into how we embed racial equity in our policy work as we move forward together. Sorry, I realized I never advanced my slide. Here you go. These are some of the partnerships that I was speaking of previously. And new partnerships are always welcome. So if there's somebody that should be at the table that's not, I hope you'll let us know. So this event today, in addition to reflecting the commitment the policy program has to racial equity, we also, and our close connection to Charmaine's Racial Equity Collective program and her work with James in that area, this event today is the next in a series of programs that are available for all nonprofit stakeholders statewide that help create more communication between the state's constitutional officers and leaders in our sector. And through those, we're also trying to explore ways that the nonprofit sector can better partner with the state and establish better public-private partnerships. I think I may have skipped one too many. So in the terms of how we're supporting public-private partnership growth in our state, one example folks will remember most likely is our work in the Census 2020, where the state and private philanthropy and operating nonprofits aligned around the shared goal of supporting self-response to the census, which is a win-win-win for everybody. So we really saw with that project how when everyone rows in the same direction and we're all aligned around a common goal, we can get a lot more done. So we're already planning for Census 2030 and thinking about how to replicate that. And there's a convening coming up for Census 2030 kickoff in a couple of weeks. And I hope those of you that want to learn more about that will join us, and we'll share that link in chat. So in addition, we've explored models in other states around public-private partnerships. And we've had several events like this where we bring in an officer from the state or an office from the state to talk about what they're doing and how the nonprofit sector can be better aligned around shared goals. And we've also explored the readiness of our sector for better public-private partnerships in our surveys, one of which just closed. And we saw that almost half of the respondents really elevated strengthening public-private partnerships as a goal over the next couple of years. So again, we invite your continued engagement with us on what that means. Public-private partnerships can be kind of a vague term, so I wanted to just talk about how we see it. So at Forefront, the way we define that is actual relationships that are well-formed, formalized relationships between local, state, federal units of government and nonprofit organizations where you can achieve and scale mutually beneficial impact on shared priorities. And the idea is that in effective partnerships, we accomplish something that neither of us could do alone. And so by coming together, we can develop proof points for major problems or pilot, incubate, scale different solutions to problems in our communities. And coming together in that way fills gaps and advances the work of both the state and the nonprofit sector. So we want to make sure through partnerships that we bring the right people to the table to help us move the ball forward, and that we're all the relevant players are together rowing in the same direction. And we think strong partnerships really do have the potential to advance racial equity in our state. So that's why we're here today. We want to support that conversation and talk about how the work of Dr. Coleman's office might be aligned with the work in the nonprofit sector, And so we invite you to participate today and ask questions as we go through the process here. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Charmene, and she'll take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Racial Equity Collective is a multi-sector collaboration of community leaders, nonprofit, and private sector organizations, as well as our funders and legislators. So what does that mean? That basically means we have several ways of connecting with the different groups and building that network together. Our goals, as I've listed in here, are primarily to serve as a catalyst to generate statewide and regional partnerships and collaborations. We also recently launched the publicly accessible statewide map that reflects already over 800 programs and policies that focus specifically on racial equity. So you will find the link to that in the chat. It's called iDream, Illinois Database of Racial Equity Asset Map. After that, we also are looking forward to working with Holly in advocating for policy changes, as well as one of the other goals that we have is to work with our funders to generate that environment of trust-based philanthropy. The framework that we've implemented, we borrowed from Race Forward, if you're familiar with that organization. And so the way we're trying to organize this work is the first step is to normalize, which is how we've come to the racial equity asset map. And then we've also worked with our cohort. That's where we're talking about operationalize. We have the Racial Equity Collective cohort that was launched this year, and they've come together from across the state, and they've put together a shared definition of racial equity that I'll review with you just in a second. But so those are a few steps that we've taken to establish that baseline, establish that shared understanding of what it means to work together to advance racial equity in Illinois. And then the last phase is organize, and that's when we're pulling from, and working with the different partners across the state to be able to work on different programs, both locally as well as scaling that up statewide. The map that I just mentioned to you a few minutes ago, if you are not on it already, you have the opportunity to join. You could either contact us at rec@myforefront.org, or when you go to this website, there is a link at the bottom right corner, at my organization. And so what this does is then connects you to all of the other over 200 other organizations across the state that share similar values in your organizations, as well as similar thematic work. And this is an opportunity to organically connect you both within the industry, as well as across the county or region that you're currently working in. So we hope that this is a valuable tool for all of you that are on here. So the racial equity definition that the cohort came up with is just addressing both the definition as a process and then as an outcome as well. It's two separate. We've had a lot of conversation in terms of what that means. And I'll just read it to you so all of you have it in front of you. But as a process, racial equity identifies and calls out historical and contemporary injustices affecting and impacting racial and ethnic groups, then works to build new structures that eliminate these systemic barriers and discriminatory practices. This process is most effective when it centers Black and Brown community members in decision-making and vision, and when it teaches about and explicitly works against white supremacy. As an outcome, racial equity closes the gap where race and ethnicity no longer predicts one's quality of life and ability to thrive. So we hope you take this definition further, implement it into your own organization, so we can continue to build that shared language that we referred to just a minute ago. The cohort that we've worked with, these are 20 of them. I believe some of them are on this call as well. We've partnered with Equal Measure, which is a national organization, UIC Great Cities Institute, as well as Dr. Coleman, who's on this call, in terms of building the curriculum and then establishing those partners for future work as well. And with that, I'd actually like to just share, with the partnership that we've already done, both of us serving communities statewide, we're continuing to work on this as the next round of cohorts come on, and in between as well through programs like today, to be able to have a statewide approach to support all of you. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Coleman, who is the Chief Equity Officer for the state of Illinois, appointed by Governor Pritzker in July 23. A transformative leader, she excels in equity and inclusion assessment, research, and teaching, with national recognition for her work in higher education equity initiatives. She has a diverse background in assessment and evaluation work, grant writing, research methodology, and teaching. Prior to joining the governor's administration, Dr. Coleman served as the equity manager of Rock County, Wisconsin, where she worked to ensure that all individuals served by the county had equal and unbiased access to services. She also served as the Associate Dean of Student Success, Equity, and Community at Beloit College, where she oversaw the college's federally funded TRIO programs and led the anti-racism liaison team. Dr. Coleman earned her doctorate in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So thank you so much for joining us here again.
Thank you so much, Charmaine, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Before I actually dive into the presentation, I also would like to address the election results and how the state is kind of viewing that. And so we understand that emotions are running high following the recent election results. For the sake of all of the important work that we do, we had hoped for a different outcome. But we must continue the efforts regardless. The state of Illinois is committed to this mission, and now it's even more crucial than ever. We anticipate that, some protections for many citizens may be compromised, but we will persist in advocating for these vital initiatives. And we know that in this climate where state protections are threatened across the country, the role of nonprofits and foundations are becoming increasingly significant. These organizations will help address the gaps left by laws and legislation that may limit state action. And so moving forward, our work will continue, because as long as there are people, there are going to be disparities requiring our attention. And so we will need a more strategic framing in our fight for racial and overall equity. I have been in contact with the legal team in the governor's office to strategize how to reposition our efforts to avoid becoming targets amid the upcoming changes. And the legal team is aware of how similar initiatives are being challenged in other states and is actively preparing for those potential obstacles. We understand that our job is to protect, the 12 million people in Illinois, and many of the millions who voted against this result. They're trusting us to protect them. And so we will take a leadership role in terms of hardening our laws to kind of protect against what's to come. And we will continue to fight. But I did also want to remind people that, the first 2 years of J.B. Pritzker's term, our governor, was under the Trump administration. And we were still able to achieve a lot during that time. Just a few things that we were able to achieve during that time was, the minimum wage was raised in Illinois. They were able to codify abortion rights and reproductive rights. They advanced LGBTQ rights. They made higher education more affordable in Illinois. They expanded mental health care services. And we've been continuing to rebuild infrastructure to create more jobs in the state. And so we achieved a lot during the first term. And so we'll continue to fight. And so as you engage with the current work being done in the state, please rest assured that we are ready to move forward. Many of our initiatives are designed to be somewhat race neutral while creatively addressing disparities and supporting marginalized groups. And although the election results were not in our favor, there's a lot of work to be done. So I hope that after this presentation, you'll feel more informed about the ongoing efforts, and that you'll be able to identify ways that you can kind of amplify some of the initiatives that are already being done by the state. So with that, I will share my screen. And so today we're going to be covering what does the state of Illinois mean by equity. I'll be discussing the Office of Equity's charge, along with Illinois Towards Equity, which is the framework in which we work with state agencies to build their equity action plans. We'll discuss some barriers that state agencies are currently having to advancing these efforts, as well as kind of connecting with the community. We'll discuss some current solutions, and then we'll kind of get into how you can support this work. I just wanted to offer, this is the Governor's Office of Equity. We are a small and mighty team, but I just wanted to show that, this isn't a 40+ staffed office. We are small and mighty, but we continue this work across the state. Our charge, so we were written into, the Office of Equity was written into executive order in 2021 by J.B. Pritzker. We were charged with embedding equity in the state of Illinois services, systems, and operations. We were tasked with creating a sustainable infrastructure and equity-oriented systems, developing statewide DEIA benchmarks and measures of progress. We coordinate the DEIA trainings that reflect best practices across the state. So these are mandated trainings for all 72,000+ state employees that they have to take annually surrounding topics of, the introduction to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have an LGBTQIA training, as well as a training for inclusive leadership. Beyond that, we also support equity-oriented efforts throughout the state to ensure services and resources are available and accessible to all in Illinois. So what do we mean by equity? In simple terms, the state and quality or ideal of being just, impartial, and fair. We work with our agencies to eliminate structural barriers that create access to opportunities proportional to the unique needs of marginalized groups and individuals to achieve equal outcomes. We always say DEIA, so diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility, because we believe that equity requires diversity, which is just the representation of the people from a variety of backgrounds. It requires inclusion, the action or state of including and feeling empowered. It's not just enough to have them at the table, but do they feel empowered and in a sense of belonging in the organization, as well as accessibility. And we extend accessibility to meaning people with disabilities, as well as individuals who speak languages other than English. And so I always like to show this graphic that I'm sure many of you have seen, but to help discuss how we define equity. We're used to seeing inequality, which is kind of demonstrated by this leaning tree. The tree is kind of indicating the systemic inequities within our society. Equality is just giving individuals the same tools, but sometimes that is not sufficient considering that there are inequalities within our society. And so you see with equity in this particular picture, they've offered these two individuals two different sized ladders to adjust for the fact of the inequities within the system. I show this because of, especially based on the recent election results, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about equity. And when sometimes people see images like this, they think that some individuals are getting additional tools or they're getting extra and they don't feel like that is fair. And so when we talk about the approaches and our work, a lot of our work is surrounding education, because there are a lot of individuals that do not understand the disparities that exist within our societies. They don't understand the systemic issues that have led to those things. And so we have to kind of educate them on those topics in order for them to see that this is not giving this individual an unfair advantage. This is just providing the individual with the tools that they need to address the inequality at hand. Before I move on to the additional work of our office, I'd like to just share that throughout the state of Illinois, equity is threaded throughout. It is not just siloed within our office. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but these are a few of the other areas where equity is at the center of their mission. And so CEI, which is the Illinois Commission of Equity and Inclusion, they are tasked with promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in awarding state contracts to business owned by minorities, women, persons with disabilities, and veterans. And so a lot of the procurement work in terms of embedding equity in procurement, a lot of that happens within their office. And so as you're listening to what the Office of Equity does, if you're feeling like some things are missing in terms of procurement or addressing employment and things like that, just know that that work is happening just in other spaces. And we all work together to kind of thread this throughout the state. Another initiative is the Business and Enterprise for Minorities. This specifically is to increase the participation of businesses owned by minorities, women, and persons with disabilities in state contracts and procurement. The BEP Act continues to work to embed equity for that. There's also the Diversity Enrichment Program. That's through the Illinois Department of Central Management Services. The DEP helps agencies diversify their workforce by providing recruitment strategies, job counseling, and informational presentations. The program aims to increase the representation of minorities, women, and individuals with disabilities in state government. And I also didn't want to forget all of the great work coming out of the Department of Human Rights, which administers the Illinois Human Rights Act, and specifically focused on discrimination against employment, housing, and public accommodations for a variety of protected classes. I also just wanted to point out that we do have support from our Attorney General. I don't know if many of you saw this, and I'll include a link in the resources that I send to Charmaine and others to be distributed out to the group. But the Attorney General, alongside 20 other Attorney Generals, sent a letter to Fortune 100 companies in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the workplace. This was a response to 13 Republican attorneys sending out information kind of undermining the efforts of equity. But the Attorney General kind of stated that diversity initiatives are not just laudable goals. They are also good for business. I have a deep commitment to working with private employers to help further diversity, equity, and inclusion in Illinois, and I will continue to be an advocate and champion of civil rights and racial progress. The letter also reiterates that corporate diversity programs are lawful and deserve important and public business purposes. That the hollow claims of unlawful discrimination against white people in Fortune 100 companies do not change the fact that women and people of color continue to face barriers in the workplace, and that businesses and workers of America should not be intimidated into abandoning diversity goals at a time when they are more important than ever. And so this is just to show that there is commitment from all sides to continue this work. And people are really being proactive in trying to send the message that regardless of election results, regardless of things like, affirmative action being overturned, that there's still a commitment to this work. Next, I'd like to address some of the challenges to this work, because I think that we are all very passionate about, gaining liberation for all and racial equity, but it does come with its challenges. And one of the big challenges, I think, is just overall change management within organizations. And I always like to bring this up because I think that sometimes we downplay how hard it is to embed change into any organization, regardless of what that change is. And so I like to bring up the Kubler-Ross change model curve template, which talks about the different emotions that individuals go through when they're presented with organizational change. And I'll go through a few of these. The first is shock, and then people go through denial, and then frustration, and then depression. Then eventually they'll experiment and make a decision, and they'll integrate the change. But if you notice the first few emotions with this, first shock, denial, frustration, and depression, these are also the same emotions that people go through when they're experiencing grief. And so when we're talking about organizational change and we're very positive about it, that's not necessarily how individuals are experiencing that change. And this might seem dramatic. I thought this was kind of dramatic when I saw it, but then I thought about when I was at an organization and they switched from using Zoom as their primary video conferencing app to Microsoft Teams. And I will say at the beginning, I was shocked. And then I went through denial because I had already scheduled and set up all of my meetings for that year. And I was like, there's no way that they're going to make me change this format all of a sudden. And then when I got the email stating that I had to, I was very frustrated and saddened by that. And so that's just a quick software change. But then we add that we're trying to create organizational change and embed equity. And I always try to say we're not into transactional or performative equity work. We really want to build a culture of equity. And a culture of equity is a culture of equity that exists when organizational policies, practices, mindsets, resource allocations, decision-making processes, and capacities are aligned to ensure that everyone has a fair and just opportunity for health and well-being. And that type of change also sometimes instills fear in individuals. This work instills fear because sometimes people have been in spaces where equity has been talked about and they have been somewhat shamed or blamed. Or people come to this with the fear because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. But people also come with a sense of fear to this work because it makes them very vulnerable. And I like to talk about the social scientist Brene Brown in one of her books. She discusses vulnerability. She's a social scientist that studies emotions. And on the chapter of vulnerability, she surveyed thousands of people on the things that make them feel the most vulnerable in their lives. And people talk about numerous things that you would expect would make people feel vulnerable. Sitting down with your children and letting them know that you're going through a divorce, that makes people feel vulnerable. Sitting with a loved one in hospice, that makes people feel vulnerable. But at the top of the list, it was actually third on the list of the things that make people feel the most vulnerable is talking about race at work. And so we have to acknowledge that this work elicits an emotional response from some individuals. They're already dealing with somewhat grief of organizational change, and then you add this emotional response with talking about race and change and equity. And so that becomes one of the biggest challenges because now we're no longer just talking about regular work processes. Now we're managing individuals' emotions. And that's why this work can feel so taxing. And so I wanted to acknowledge that to say that we're all for this work, but we understand that it's not easy. And so our approaches are there to meet people where they're at, to disarm people, and also clear up some of the misconceptions about this work. And one of the last challenges that I'll talk about is capacity. That capacity at the state level is always going to be a challenge. There's turnover in positions. Sometimes there's lack of funding, and sometimes, in the current climate of, what's going on with the election, there's just, like human capacity issues as we're dealing with what's going on in our society. And so that's another area that nonprofits and foundations can come in with some of like the research. You guys have networks all across the nation on how this work is being done. And sharing that information with us can mean so much when we don't always have the capacity to kind of look up what's happening in other states or how they got certain legislation passed. So that can definitely be one of the areas that'll be helpful from nonprofits and foundations in helping the state's efforts. And when we talk about these efforts, we do also focus on the leaders because the leaders have to foster belonging in our agencies. John A. Powell, who is a researcher of belonging, he stated that across our communities, regions, states, we are witnessing increased anxiety, much of it related to an increase in the perceived other. The 2016 election is a crystallized version of this, with major consequences that we are witnessing unfold daily. Tapping into it can take us in two directions: towards breaking, where we turn inward only to what we know and who we know. This path leads ultimately to politics of isolation. The other direction is bridging, where we turn outwardly to connect and explicitly work with other groups and seek ways to build common ground. This path ultimately takes us towards belonging and empathy. And that's the direction that we should be leading. And that work has to happen from the top. It's the leaders of these agencies and these organizations that have the ability to bridge when sometimes our anxieties and our fears make us want to break and isolate. And when we're talking about bridging, I'd like to reiterate that sometimes when we're talking about exclusion versus inclusion, we only see exclusion as just excluding people, and we only see inclusion as just like, okay, they're there. We've allowed them a seat at the table. But inclusion is not about assimilating to the status quo of what was already there. What we want to move into is belonging, and belonging is going to look a little different. This little belonging bubble, it's not even like a clear circle anymore. And it shouldn't be, because true belonging is inviting all of the insights, all of the experiences, all of the innovations that come from diverse perspectives and diverse individuals into a space. And that is what we hope to do as we continue to collaborate with foundations and nonprofits, is allow them all into the space so that we can come up with creative solutions to really helping all of Illinoisans. So moving from there, I'll get into Illinois Towards Equity, which is the framework in which we work with state agencies to develop their DEIA action plans. We work with all of the state agencies and commissions underneath the governor's cabinet, as well as some state commissions that have opted in to the work as they progress their equity work. So at this point, we're at about 42 agencies and commissions throughout the state. The Illinois Toward Equity guides them through the creation of these plans, and it provides a formal reporting process for accountability. So they submit an annual report to our office, a mid-year check-in, as well as an end-of-year report to see what they've accomplished. Our Illinois Towards Equity framework focuses on 5 action domains for the workforce and accountability. These 5 action domains are training and education, opportunity and advancement, infrastructure and accountability, organizational climate and culture, and thriving communities. These are all ways that one can embed equity into their agency. So with training and education, increasing the state workforce of their knowledge and skills. When we're talking about opportunity advancement, this is generating new opportunities for employment by systematically reviewing, revising, and replacing and creating agency-specific recruitment and retention policies and practices. Infrastructure and accountability is building a practical, sustainable, and effective DEIA infrastructure. All of these agencies are very different, and so they have to meet their employees where they're at. And sometimes an agency doesn't have the proper infrastructure to embed certain practices like trainings or like advancement opportunities. And so building that infrastructure can be very important. The 4th one is organizational climate and culture. This is eliminating ongoing institutional and systemic barriers within the processes and culture of work. And lastly, there's thriving communities. And this is improving the well-being of the public by making changes to government-managed structures, lands, infrastructure, policies, and practices. And all of these things are to increase the access to resources, services, remedies, and spaces necessary for rebuilding health, safety, and opportunity for all Illinoisans. To take a glance at what that looks like in 2024, this is a glimpse of 199 goals from the 42 agencies from across the state. As you can see, the majority of the goals do fall into thriving communities, and then they're somewhat evenly distributed amongst organizational culture and climate, infrastructure and accountability, opportunity and advancement, and training and education. Now, I just want to take you through quickly just some examples of how agencies are embedding equity utilizing these domains. So if we look at training and education examples, some of them are redesigning training and professional development with formal DEIA training. Some of them are creating continuous learning that develops cultural competence and equity awareness. And some of them are doing more informal learning to ensure that employees understand diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And when we're talking about training and education, sometimes people assume we only mean formal training surrounding DEIA. But this could be anything. This could be implementing a 15-minute conversation into your already scheduled weekly staff meeting that just discusses any equity issues that your agency or organization is experiencing. This could be including information in a monthly newsletter. There are a variety of ways that training and education can happen. Next, when we're talking about opportunity advancement, Some examples of this are for IEMA, which is the Illinois Emergency Management Agency. They want to ensure that their workforce reflects that of the labor force, with an increase in representation of African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and the LGBTQ plus and female population. But in terms of that, you can also move to retention and advancement. And so you can address barriers in terms of hiring, retention, promotion. In procurement, our IT department is increasing the utilization of historically underrepresented firms when they're contracting with procurement. And some are thinking about, opportunity advancement in terms of what does their agency's leadership look like. So for DCEO, they're looking at a leadership in policymaking being representative of the communities and the departments they serve. Next, we have infrastructure and accountability. Again, these are ensuring that agencies even have the infrastructure to carry out some of this work. And so some of that is about building maybe a DEIA committee so that there's a host of individuals who are tasked and accountable for this work. Some of this is making sure that leadership and supervisors demonstrate accountability, commitment, and involvement in these initiatives. So often this work is just delegated to one individual, very low in the organizational chart, where leadership must be involved in this work for it to be successful. And some of this has to do with hiring necessary staff to do this work. And so hiring additional employees that can serve as agencies' DEIA coordinators, someone's work who's dedicated to just persisting in this work and not just an individual who has just had this task dumped on their already large portfolio. Getting into culture and climate examples, ensuring that things are fair and inclusive, revising policies and so they don't lead to biased outcomes, ensuring that agencies have, specific incentives to ensure that there's equity. So things like bilingual pay. And then sometimes agencies don't understand the issues that are happening within their agencies. And so conducting internal DEIA climate surveys to kind of get a sense of where there could be better attention to these issues. And finally, thriving communities. Again, that was the biggest of the goals that the state is focusing on, because so many of our agencies are community focused and ensuring that there's equal access for all Illinoisans. And so some of this has to do with data equity, continuing to identify and mitigate barriers to equitable utilization of agency services. This could be a survey assessment, learning more about the potential inequities in access and experience, or this could be into grant making. So want to expand equitable access to state and federal resources. And I'll delve into that in a little bit, but these are some of the examples of when we're thinking about thriving communities in Illinois, these are some of the examples that agencies are already working on. So what are some of the barriers to effective collaboration with the public? I engaged with some agencies to kind of ask what they've been seeing, what obstacles and challenges have they been having. And so they discussed things such as information silos. As I talked about, there's a lot of different work happening in the state of Illinois, and I'm doing my best to kind of keep all of those groups together in communication. But sometimes there are information silos where there's a particular initiative and other departments just don't know about it. And so we're currently working to figure out a better system of bringing together all of this work so that we're all in the know, so we can all be targeted in our efforts to help the community. Other barriers have been multiple departments distributing information. Some communities sometimes feel overwhelmed when they get things from different departments. They don't know exactly who they should go to for support, or sometimes they're just bombarded and don't want to get involved in general. And so we're working to identify who's sending out information, how is that information being sent out, and ensuring that the community knows who they should get in touch with if they have questions, and what specific departments should they reach out to for specific initiatives. We've heard that the grant process is cumbersome, so there is work on making that less cumbersome, and I'll talk about some potential solutions moving forward. Sometimes there are political differences. At the end of the day, as we saw with the recent election result, you know, people have a variety of things that they find important to them. And so sometimes if one agency is doing a specific initiative, but the community is not aligned politically with some aspect of that, that can be a barrier. Another barrier is that sometimes groups want ownership of their ideas and don't want it taken over by a larger group. Oftentimes, the larger groups have the funding and the capacity to take this work much further. But sometimes groups don't want to work with the state and have the state kind of take ownership of those ideas. Sometimes they want to stay grassroots and continue those efforts and you know, get that recognition for all of the hard work they're doing. And a final barrier, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, this is just a few, but a final barrier is a lack of credible messengers. I think as we all know, there's not always trust for the state for a variety of really good reasons. Historically, for brown and Black and marginalized communities, the state has not always been an ally. And so we have to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge that we need credible messengers to share some of the resources that we have. And that's where nonprofits and foundations come into play, where sometimes you have that trust that the state doesn't have. And we can use you as a mode to, like, we might have the resources, we might have the initiatives, but you might be the messengers of really getting this into the hands of the individuals that need it. Some current solutions to some of those barriers are thinking about grassroots organizations and partnering with them, focus on small startup nonprofits who are close to the people that we are trying to work with. They can sometimes be seen as those credible messengers that I was just talking about. In terms of additional credible messengers, figuring out who those people are. Identifying those individuals, whether they're within the state or they're outside of the state, and collaborating with them, partnering with them, and continuing a conversation with them so that we can maintain that trust with the public. Becoming a part of the community, something that we've heard a lot is that sometimes they feel that the relationships with the state is very transactional, that we only come around when we're trying to survey for information or things of that sort. So engaging with community, not just when we want to, you know, survey information from them, or not just when we want to like tell them something new, but really becoming a part of the community, engaging in some of their programming so they see us as true allies and not as this separate entity. Some are doing racial equity analyses programs in order to identify recommended actions to promote equity. And so some are just looking at their specific programs and figuring out who is falling through the gaps, who are they not reaching, and analyzing strategies on how to reach out to those specific groups. And in reducing barriers, like I said, many find things like grant processes and things like that very cumbersome. And so some groups are moving away from having people submit an entire grant to be acknowledged for something, because that can take so long and so much energy, and maybe just switching to letter of intent so that even if you don't get the funds, you didn't utilize so much time and capacity in getting there. So at the state level, there's a lot of additional work happening to embed equity. One is incorporating equity into NOFOs. And we look at best practices for doing that. There is a variety of ways that we could do that. Some is in designing equitable eligibility criteria, so avoiding restrictive requirements, considering capacity building support, and prioritizing local organizations. Another is developing equitable evaluation criteria. And that is where the state is kind of leaning in the approaches that they are trying. And so this is prioritizing equity-focused projects. This is considering organizational capacity, so evaluating applicants' capacity to implement the proposed project, and including their experience working with marginalized communities, as well as including qualitative factors. And so the applicant's commitment to equity and diversity as being a part of the evaluation process. In addition, some agencies and work groups surrounding incorporating equity into NOFOs are moving to kind of providing technical assistance and capacity building. So offering workshops and webinars to provide trainings on grant writing and financial management and things of that sort. Some are moving to establish mentoring programs, and I'll kind of give an example about that in a moment, and offering other individual technical assistance, so one-on-one support for applicants or other individuals that need help with processes like this in working with the state. And so the current work group working on incorporating NOFOs in Illinois, we understand that, there are federal regulations that provides guidelines for incorporating equity into post-award grant procurement, but they wanted to focus on what can the current governance do in terms of maybe a merit-based review process. And so the current efforts are looking at a two-prong approach. So when looking at these grants, awarding points or a weighted value to applicants who meet equity-based criteria, so centering that. Another effort surrounding this would be looking at the demographic data and geographic areas that are being served. So awarding points to applicants that provide services to individuals who reside in either a disproportionately impacted area or qualified census tract. So for example, areas that share a population in households with less than 150% of the poverty level, or 50% of the households with incomes below 60% of the area median gross income. And so we're looking at creative and strategic ways to kind of give award points to individuals that really are focused on marginalized communities, and hoping that this helps increase and promote equity. Second is we also have work groups thinking and working on equity in GATA. Their main objective is leveraging best practices and methodologies used by current state Illinois grantees. And so they're currently identifying potential GATA champions is what they're calling them. And these are small size grantee organizations that understand and apply overarching GATA governance necessary to successfully applying for and managing grant award funding. So they're working with these individuals. They're establishing a work group to figure out how they have been successful, what specific collaborations do they have, what specific agencies do they work with, what are their strategies, and they're going to create a series of workshops around those strategies that we know are working, that best practices that we know are working, and help others kind of take advantage of those best approaches. Another example is the Illinois Housing Development Authority launched a new program supporting emerging housing developers. This is an example of how individuals are specifically focused on helping BIPOC, developers reduce barriers into development. And so this is called the Next Gen program, and it provides training and technical assistance to BIPOC developers. The initiative is part of the Illinois Housing Development's efforts to support a diverse pool of affordable housing developers in Illinois. They provide training and technical assistance. There are mentorship and networking opportunities, as well as access to capital. NextGen will provide access to pre-development financing and other resources to help BIPOC developers secure projects for low-income housing. And so this is one of the examples where I was saying, where nonprofits and foundations can come to help, because a lot of these new initiatives are trying these mentorship opportunities, because they believe that if if a big developer can mentor a smaller developer, a smaller BIPOC developer, then that will give them this advantage and give them the tools and the knowledge they need to progress. But a lot of these big developers don't see the benefit in doing that. And so if nonprofits or foundations know of actual developers or bigger businesses that would be open to mentoring smaller businesses or smaller entities, that type of information, getting that type of information is key to moving some of these efforts along, because that has been one of the biggest barriers in some programs like this. But NextGen is a significant step towards increasing diversity in housing development, because it provides BIPOC developers with essential tools and resources, and it aims to create more affordable housing opportunities and build more equitable future for Illinois. Now, another larger act, and we're thinking statewide about racial equity, is the Equity and Racial Justice Act. The Equity and Racial Justice Act was signed in 2021, and we recently amended it in 2023. And this acknowledges the historical inequities that aim to identify and rectify existing gaps, understanding that these disparities are crucial to all levels. And so this comes through the Office of Equity, and we are tasked with helping state agencies align all of their data collection surrounding racial demographics along with other demographics. And so for individual agencies, the Act requires assessing existing data, building an infrastructure for new data collection, and ensuring that gathered information is used effectively. At the statewide level, this act enables measurement of program outcomes and impacts, cross-agency data comparison to understand programs' effectiveness, and ultimately addressing unidentified equity gaps. And so aligning how data is collected throughout the state is very important. And a lot of states are struggling with how to do this effectively. And this is a long-term plan that's probably not going to be fully implemented until 2026. But those are our current efforts of building that infrastructure within agencies so that we're all collecting the same data so that we can identify who's falling through the cracks across Illinois. So how can the nonprofit sector help accomplish some of our goals? Well, one is around building community trust. As I said, sometimes there is not trust for state agencies or a state government for good reason. So if we can collaborate and you can help us build that trust or just be a credible messenger to the public, that would be very helpful. Providing education and effective ways to engage with state government. And so if there are initiatives that other states are doing, or if you have particular ideas, working with us, providing some of that information to help with like our capacity issues, that would be very helpful. And then lastly, sharing resource information. There's a variety of initiatives, and resources for the state, but sometimes we're not reaching the very groups and populations that need these resources the most. So you sharing these things would be the utmost important. And so one of those things is a new initiative coming out of the Department of Human Rights, which is Help Stop Hate. Governor Pritzker and the U.S. Department of Justice have jointly invested millions to combat hate in Illinois, supporting the Department of Human Rights and the Illinois Commission on Discrimination and Hate Crimes. And so Help Stop Hate is a program that's aimed to improve hate act reporting by offering an option separate from law enforcement, as many communities may hesitate to label incidents as hate crimes or involve the police. And so these reports are submitted online or via a specialist trained in culturally competent trauma-informed care. And then with that information, it will then be anonymized, and the data will be used by state and federal agencies to highlight trends and guide resource allocation, service improvement, and policy strengthening to help stop hate in Illinois. And so this could be something that nonprofits and organizations could share to get the word out. I will provide a media toolkit in the resources that I send to be distributed amongst the participants. But this is an example of what's in the media toolkit to help spread the word on something like this. This is a social media post just to give people information about this new initiative that could really bring a stop to hate, but also give us data on what our communities are really experiencing. Another way that nonprofits can be helpful, I said, is sharing information. And so one of the things that came up as a topic to wanting to be discussed was, how can we work together to improve the timeframes for state contracts payments in such a way as to reduce the burden on smaller nonprofits that are more likely to be led by persons of color. And so we don't have any current work in Illinois happening at this moment. However, we're working with other nonprofits who have provided what's happening in other states, which gives us a template and an example of things that we could incorporate into our work. And so this is an example of at the Colorado Department of Public Health. They've redesigned the payment structure for grant-funded programs to provide advance payments to certain grantees. And so The prevention services and implementation process, they provide up to 25% of the total award value immediately upon execution or renewal of a contract. And this can empower smaller organizations to carry out important public health programs that serve vulnerable populations. And so we do understand that timeframes and money is an obstacle for some of these smaller nonprofits and for the public. And so providing examples like these to the Office of Equity and other entities gives us a template that we can look into in terms of how we can legislatively or how we can kind of amend some of our processes to make things more equitable. And what are immediate opportunities for partnership and collaboration between the nonprofit sector and state government? And so one is the Office of Equity does monthly peer-to-peer exchanges. This is an opportunity for state agencies and sometimes out-of-state agencies to share best practices in incorporating equity. This is an area of collaboration. We get community feedback and we share resources. And so if nonprofits and foundations have important information that they want state agencies to know. If you have identified certain barriers to working with state agencies that you feel like state agencies are unaware of, we can provide you a platform to present to the state agencies to inform them of that. That's how we can keep this conversation going. In addition to that, our office does also put out an equity newsletter where many of the state agencies look to for information, for equity tools and things of that sort. And so if there are particular insights that you would like to share, that is another mode that you can share through. And so with that, I am open to questions. And if you don't have any particular questions at the moment, things you can be thinking about as we continue this conversation are, what are challenges do you notice that maybe weren't mentioned in this presentation? How can the state better communicate with the public? If you found a better avenue, please do share. And what are ways we can keep this conversation going? Because challenges are consistently changing. The ways in which the public want to interface with the state is consistently changing. And so be thinking about ways that, this isn't just like a one-off, but what are ways that we can continue this conversation so that we're continuously helping the public. So with that, thank you. And I will stop sharing my screen if I can figure out where that button is. Okay, there it is.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I really appreciate you trying to tackle some of our questions, which we understand weren't easy questions, so thank you. We're still seeing your PowerPoint screen, Dr.
Oh,
Coleman.
you are? See, I didn't push it right. 1 second. Sorry.
I need to take that down. No worries.
Okay, there we go.
So I do want to pause and invite any verbal questions from the audience. I don't see any in chat, but does anyone have a question?
This is Josh Kaufman from Teach Plus. I have a sort of a general question. First of all, thank you, Dr. Coleman. Really great presentation. And I didn't know all of the work that the state was doing. Also, I'm not trying to look like I'm in witness protection, just the sun was shining in. I'm curious, in places where there are equity gaps, frequently there are a variety of issues. There may be inadequate access to housing and healthcare and mental health care and schools that may not be performing as well as we'd like. To what extent is your office or is the state able to think sort of holistically about the combination of things that a community would need to get to equity, as opposed to those being in specific agency silos?
Absolutely. And I think that that's the conversation that's starting to happen. And so when I talked about the Equity and Racial Justice Act, a lot of times we try to have these conversations, but we don't have the data to kind of support some of these things. And so our hope is that by aligning with the Equity and Racial Justice Act, when we're all collecting the same demographic information in the same way, and it's all in the same database, we'll be able to actually look at that from a 500-foot level. Because right now we collect data, but it is somewhat siloed. So we might be able to see, how there might be someone struggling with the Department of Family Services. And that's kind of seen as like one particular issue. But in other places that I've been where you can see kind of a broader view of that data, you're able to see how that person is also having issues with housing. You're also able to see how maybe they dealt with maybe some incarceration and weren't provided the proper support afterwards. So then we're all able to have a conversation together to find where exactly did they fall through the cracks, because now they're having issues with family and children's services because they didn't have proper housing. That's not an issue of them being a parent. That's another gap that we need to fill. And so we're working from like the data level, but until we get there, when I talk about some of those peer-to-peer exchanges and some of those other meetings, that's where we kind of share some of these obstacles that we're seeing, where other agencies can be like, hey, you know, I think actually that this is probably impacting your thing. And something else that we're doing, we also partnered with FEMA and worked with them on figuring out kind of how to have an equitable view during disasters. And by doing that, we actually found out that when people think about disasters, they usually think about like the recovery effort of like the immediate thing, like a hurricane happens, FEMA comes in, and then they don't think about FEMA anymore. FEMA actually stays in those areas for sometimes up to like a year, helping individuals after that. By bringing FEMA in to talk with our agencies were able to see that a huge issue in terms of emergency management is that so many people are uninsured or underinsured. So they're able to kind of see a preventative thing to another agency's problem of educating individuals about how to get proper insurance, how to get certain aid and grants to help with those sorts of things. And so bringing in conversation is one part, but I think the biggest fix will probably be bringing in all of this data, because that will really allow us to see where we're maybe failing some individuals with some of our procedures and not kind of communicating across agencies properly.
Any other questions? I have some. So, and then if folks think of more, please continue chiming in. So this one should be relatively simple. Can you specifically explain next steps for folks that may want to start receiving the newsletter you mentioned, and also how to get information about either attending or presenting at the peer-to-peer exchanges?
Absolutely. So in the information I send, kind of with the media toolkit about Stop Hate and this presentation, I'll include the Office of Equity's email address. If you email us, we can add you to our newsletter, so you'll get that. And it is a quarterly newsletter, so don't expect it monthly, but you'll be added to that. And then you can email or me directly if you're interested in doing a peer-to-peer presentation. We're planning our 2025 presentation list, and so we can definitely add you to that. If you're interested in presenting, let me know. But if you're just interested in attending, we can add you to that listserv, so you'll get those calendar invites.
Wonderful, thanks. So we'll include that with our follow-ups. So to folks in the room, you can expect that. I wanted to ask about some issues related to government contracting, because I know a lot of folks in the room either are grant makers that have a perspective of like seeing what their grantees struggle with when it comes to contracting federally or at the state level. And they know how burdensome that process can be and how disruptive untimely or unpredictable payments can be to their just ability to run their businesses. And then we also, of course, have operating nonprofits in our fold that are directly impacted and grappling with those things. So we've done a lot of work in our policy program on that issue. And one of the things we did was research in partnership with the Health and Human Services Coalition, who has the most trouble and with what agencies. And then we disaggregated all of that around organizations that are led by or serving persons of color, And we saw some really concerning patterns. And so we're in the process now of formulating that policy response. And we've been negotiating closely with the state agencies on that, including Gombe, and others in the executive branch. So I'm curious if you can, some of this stuff in your presentation was very specific around ideas about how to improve the NOFO process and really encouraging thinking there. So I'm curious if you can explain how your office specifically is trying to implement those things with grant making agencies at the state, and what we might be able to do to help move the ball forward on those things. So like, to what degree are you actually actively implementing those across state agencies, or is that more aspirational in the direction you want to go? And if so, how can we help? That's a lot of questions, but I hope that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. So that work is actively underway. And so our office is acting as a thought partner along with other groups, because, you know, as I discussed in the beginning, there's a lot of other entities working on this who specifically work on procurement and grant making and things of that sort. So we're our office is on the work group to act as a thought partner as they explore a variety of these things so that we can stay aligned with all of that. Both of these are kind of in their infancy, and so it will take time, but I'll say that how y'all could help is we're always looking for actual data of the obstacles. And so if you all are like open to being like invited to like one of those work groups to kind of discuss what you all are seeing, that type of information is invaluable. There's a certain perspective people have from working on the state side that always isn't aligned with what's actually happening within these communities. And so that type of data, so that we're not consistently trying to survey the public, because, you know, that survey fatigue is real, that type of stuff is invaluable. And so if anyone listening feels like they're like, I know 5 major things that are impacting those things right now, get in contact with us. We can send you an invite to one of those work group meetings so that you can give us those real insights to incorporate that into it. We're also working to involve the voices of grassroots organizations and the community. So if you know of individuals who are willing, who trust the state enough to actually work with us, let us know, because we do want to make this a collaborative process. We don't just want those from the top making decisions. We want to work across to ensure that we're actually doing things that would work for the community.
Thank you. I appreciate all that. I do think one of the things we've talked about in other settings with other state leaders is the idea of creating some sort of work group where we can sit down and with advocates and with grant making personnel to actually hammer out ways to improve the process. And that may not actually require legislation. In a lot of ways, it could just be policies and procedures or administrative rulemaking. Some things would potentially require legislation, but we'd really like to work with you on that work group idea and see what your office might be able to do to support it. And we've talked to others about that same concepts, like Deputy Governor Ho. So I can follow up with you on that. I'm also curious if you can talk a little bit long-term about the stability of your office. So for example, knowing we're approaching a point where the budget process is going to be very difficult. In recent days, we've had a lot of news about that, where we, expect up to a $3 billion shortfall the next year. So I'm curious if you perceive any threat to your office's work, either related to budget challenges, and if so, what we could do to help with that. And then secondly, longer term, when the administration inevitably changes, like what can we do to help protect the office long term and make sure it's stable over the long term in future administrations?
Absolutely. So to address the first question, as long as J.B. Pritzker is governor, he's made a commitment that this office will exist and we will be funded. So I'm not concerned in the immediate future. Like I said, I have been having discussions with legal to ensure that all of the work that we're doing doesn't become targeted. And so what that looks like is we're still strategizing. It could be a change in framing. We could change some language to kind of just prevent people from identifying us as promoting something that maybe this country no longer supports. But we are here to stay. It might look different, it might be framed different, but our efforts will continue. In terms of long-term, I am in conversation with other states who have managed to move their Office of Equity or something similar to it from executive order to statute. Only a couple of states have been successful in that, and some are in the progress of that at the moment. But that would probably be the best sustainable effort to, if there is an administration change, to keeping this work going. So I am looking at that. But our office always works from the perspective that we are really threading this work throughout the state of Illinois. And these action plans that agencies provide us, it really is setting up that agency to continue this work on their own. So if something were to happen to our office, it doesn't mean that the work stops, because it's still continuing at all of these state agencies. And so we're trying to empower the DEIA leads across the state to continue this work. Obviously, it's helpful to have an office within the governor's office that promotes it, but at the end of the day, we have to thread it, because looking at the current climate, we have to be prepared for whatever happens. But I'm not concerned in the immediate future, and we're still working to solidify things so that we can stay in the future.
Definitely let us know if you introduce legislation to codify your office. I know that would be something that a lot of folks would be eager to support. Other
Appreciate it.
questions? So I will follow up with you, Dr. Coleman, because I can provide you some of the research we did about grant making state agencies, and then I would really look forward to continuing that conversation about our efforts around government contracting. And I'll pause and see if there's any more questions, or if Charmaine or James want to chime in with any wrap up stuff. And if not, we can wrap up a little early, which is never a bad thing.
There was one thing I actually forgot to mention. Our next round of cohort application is launching on December 12th. So keep an eye out for that, and please do sign up for the newsletters. That's where we share all the information coming up. And we also, not just the cohort, but we have other events throughout the year to address many of the issues that come up either in the political landscape or in the news or legally or any of those things. So before we wrap, I do want to acknowledge James Hayakawa, who's been helping us on the back end organizing. He is my teammate in the Racial Equity Collective program. So thank you, James, and thank you, Emily, as well. She's our program manager at our program team as well. So because of the two of them, we're able to do this so seamlessly. So I really appreciate both of you. Any questions you have, Holly and I are always available. There's several emails that we've been sharing with you throughout. So any one of those you can reach out to. And like we mentioned, both of us mentioned that we work closely together. So if it's relevant to her, I'll connect with her, and vice versa. And same with Dr. Coleman as well. So we can forward some of your questions that you might be thinking about afterwards to Dr. Coleman also. The recording will be available after this, and then we'll also have the slides available too if you're interested in receiving those copies. So with that, I think we could probably wrap up early. Unless there's any last comments from anyone.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. If you want to offer any closing thoughts, you may, and with that, we'll wrap up.
No, thank you everyone who attended for listening, and I was serious, and please reach out to our office if you have ideas or you want to collaborate. as we all move forward in this work, it's going to take all of us to continue to push this work forward. So I hope everyone's able to take care of themselves in this time, and just know that we are here to support you. And someone asked, yes, okay, you answered that question. Excellent. But I hope everyone has a good rest of their week.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Hang in there.